We're going to be learning about the sociology of worthiness from Professor Sara Rankin, who works at the School of Law at Seattle University and also is the founder of the Human Rights Advocacy Project, Homeless Rights Advocacy Project. So there's a few documents, there's an agenda, there's a list of resources on each table, and we're going to be doing a good amount of work after we learn the basics, and we're going to be planning together as a team about what that means for New Horizons and how we can help our young people to live a life where just struggling to exit street life is not in and of itself a crime. So we really appreciate Sara for taking the time to come out today. Everyone noticed the beautiful arrangement of tomatoes and cucumbers, that was done by our brand new apprentice, Des, our kitchen apprentice. So he was very excited to help feed you all today. We went to cash and carry, it was an interesting journey. So we broke a bunch of water bottles. So I'll leave it to Sara, and here we go.
Thanks, Nicole. I apologize for not standing up while Nicole was introducing me. I'm just afraid if I get out of this chair, I won't be able to get back into it. My feet don't reach the ground. So this is a really cool podium too, and thanks to Nicole for fashioning it. You know, I spent a lot of time researching New Horizons before coming here and talking with you today. And it really seems to me that all of the projects and efforts that you're involved in are really, 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 truly amazing. And it struck me that all of you are really focused on trying to acknowledge and respond to pain and suffering in other people. And this is remarkable because, as I was telling Nicole, in the work that I do, I see all sorts of reactions to the pain and suffering of other people, and it's not always to do something about it personally. Sometimes people respond by turning a blind eye or sort of denying that anything is going on. Other times people respond by simply sort of feeling bad and going on with their daily lives. But you all are here because you're volunteering. I don't know if you know that, but that makes you guys activists. It means that you are engaged in change. It means that you refuse to accept the status quo. And that means that you refuse to tolerate certain circumstances as they are. That's, you know, that act of seeing, validating, and protecting the humanity of other people is really, 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 really profound. And it means that you guys are, it makes sense to me that it's called New Horizons, because I think it's just as much about New Horizons for other people as it is New Horizons within ourselves. And that's what I want to focus on today. What you're doing takes a lot of time, it takes love, it takes courage, and I'm sure for many of you, you recognize that it takes humility as well. That is a lot of what I talk to people about when I talk about the criminalization of homelessness. I'm not sure how, oh, I think I just turned this, okay, there he is. I never really have an opportunity to quote business people as a lawyer. I generally try to avoid it. But this admonition was really too perfect to keep to myself. This is Randall Stevenson, and just this week, he went and issued a big public statement, and he wanted to go on the record as the CEO of a major American company that his views about race and discrimination had changed. And it was due to, he went to a talk that one of his colleagues gave about race and discrimination. He spent some time with people who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and he read a bunch of books, and he felt transformed. And he felt like he had to say something, you know, as the CEO of this particular company. And I really loved what he said because it frames a lot of what I'll be talking about today. This is what he said. He said, "Tolerance is for cowards. Being tolerant requires nothing from you, but to be quiet and to not make waves. Holding tightly to your views and judgments without being challenged. Do not tolerate each other. Work hard, move into uncomfortable territory, and understand each other." I love this phrase because I think it really goes to the challenge that I want to issue to all of us today. And I want us to consider the possibility that you cannot be both courageous and comfortable at the same time. What I mean by that is that discomfort is actually a virtue in this line of work. Part of the reason for discomfort being a virtue is because it requires us to recognize the ways that we unintentionally, even unconsciously, are contributing to the problem, even as we're trying to be part of the solution. So it's helpful to think about implicit bias. How many of you have ever heard the phrase implicit bias? A few of you. If you have watched TV or read a book or walked outside your door anytime in the last 60 to 70 years, it's really hard to miss how much of the national discussion and action is focused on topics like race, gender, religious faith. All of these topics are really, really animated in society right now. And what's interesting about that focus is, if you think about, just take a moment and think about the last time that you were either overhearing or engaged in a discussion about discrimination or bias around race, gender, religion, any of those topics, and think about your level of comfort, how comfortable you felt. In all likelihood, unless you were speaking to people who already agreed with you, you were feeling some level of discomfort. For a lot of people, engaging in those sorts of debates is not just uncomfortable, it's terrifying, and it's painful. And people on all sides of the equation end up feeling completely misunderstood. Books like Whistling Vivaldi, I just finished Blind Spot, it's a great book. Dog Whistle Politics, there's a terrific book called Envy Up and Scorn Down. Whistling Vivaldi, all of these books, and along with sociological studies that have been done, if you get a chance, go online and take Harvard's implicit bias test. That's been going on for well over a couple decades now. All of those resources can really help us to understand the nature and scope of implicit bias. And these are really stereotypes and beliefs of which we are completely unaware, and yet at the same time operate within all of us. And for most of us, it seems inconceivable, right? We're on the right side of this. We're all doing good work. We have, really strong, good intentions. It seems inconceivable to us that we could be suffering from implicit bias. But in the words of this dude named Dr. David Rock, it's a cool name, but he's actually a neuroscientist. If you have a brain, you are biased. And grappling with that helps us to see the ways that we have institutional, systemic issues outside of us and within ourselves. So implicit bias, even without us knowing, influences our perceptions and our actions, right? It influences how we structure our neighborhoods, our transportation systems, our education systems. It influences who gets to determine these crazy voting districts that determine voting power. It determines who we hire, who we fire, who gets paid the most, who gets paid the least, who we promote, who we incarcerate. And if you've read, my mentor, Brian Stevenson, has this amazing book called Just Mercy, and he instructs us that implicit bias even determines who we sentence to death. So these discussions about implicit bias are far from comfortable. They're super messy, they're terrifying, but they are absolutely vital to securing any sort of change in humanity overall, but especially within ourselves. That's why it requires both courage and humility to do the work that you do, that I do. I'm here today to really focus on, let's see how this is do something again? Oh, I got it. Okay. To really focus on a quieter problem, this is one that is another topic that requires us to be both courageous and uncomfortable at the same time. Like gender, race, and faith-oriented debates, there's disagreements about this issue that are pervasive throughout American society, but unlike debates about race, gender, and faith, this issue is much less commonly understood. People are much less reflective about it and aware about how it operates within ourselves. And as a lawyer, I'm really particularly interested in how implicit bias, our fears, and our anxieties become codified in our laws and policies, right? And these are laws and policies that are intended to make some feel more comfortable and more protected, but unknowingly, even unintentionally at the same time, these same laws serve to make others less comfortable, less protected, and further marginalized. So it's important for us to think about, regardless of our very, very good work and regardless of our good intentions, we all have to own the fact that we are all complicit in creating the circumstances within which homelessness and poverty can thrive. We're all part of this problem. I think I have to point it that way there. And there. I think if we're able to do this, we really can get ourselves to a position where we can make much smarter decisions about how we can help to reverse the contributions that we make, right, to this problem. It's so difficult. I was telling Nicole I was on a listserv for my neighborhood even last night, and there's a bunch of business associations and neighborhood associations that are forming to oppose a piece of legislation that I was involved in drafting. It's a piece of legislation that provides rights for people experiencing homelessness to have some place to be without being prosecuted for being there. I wish I would have brought some of those exchanges along with me so that you can see how difficult of a conversation this is. It may feel less difficult for you, but for some people, they're just they so completely reject the possibility that anything that they would have to say about homelessness could be a reflection of their own fears and anxieties, as opposed to a reflection of an interest in sort of elevating humanity, generally speaking. So this process of codifying our fears and anxieties into our laws and policies, in my circles we call that the criminalization of homelessness. There we go. Criminalization refers to laws that prohibit or severely restrict one's ability to engage in necessary life-sustaining conduct in public, even when that person has no reasonable alternative. And so examples of these laws are laws that criminalize sitting in public, standing, sleeping, receiving food, going to the bathroom, asking for help, and protecting oneself from the elements. These are things that none of us can forego for very long and still survive. And yet the act of surviving in public is so tightly regulated that people experiencing homelessness cannot help but get caught up in the web of these laws. They cannot help but somehow trip a wire that ends up having significant, potentially life-altering consequences. Criminalization laws, it's important to state at the outset, when I use that phrase criminalization, it doesn't mean that that particular law has to start as a criminal charge. Not all of them do. Many do start as criminal charges. Many do. But they can also start as civil infractions. This is a ticket that I give you that has some conditions or requirements, like show up to court, avoid this big area for a significant period of time, or how about pay a fee. These circumstances are extremely difficult for poor and homeless people to meet, and when they fail to do so because of sickness, mental illness, lack of transportation, lack of money, that misdemeanor can then that civil infraction can then mutate into a misdemeanor. So it starts as a civil infraction, you fail to comply, now it's a misdemeanor. And once you're saddled with a misdemeanor, that can render you ineligible for many benefits and services that are actually supposed to be there to help lift you out of homelessness, to give you that possibility of actually lifting yourself out of homelessness. So by criminalizing the act of survival in public, we have actually left men, women, and children worse off than they were before. They are more resistant to recovery. They are more likely to remain on the streets. They are more likely to self-medicate. They're more likely to get sick. They're more likely to become incarcerated, and they're even more likely to die as a result. So all of these criminalization laws come at a significant cost, not just to the lives and liberties of poor men, women, and children, but also to society more generally speaking. There's a range of studies. You know, it would take up my entire house. There's a huge range of studies that prove that criminalizing homelessness is far more expensive than the provision of non-punitive alternatives such as affordable housing or mental health treatment. And yet we persist. If it's such a bad idea, if it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, why do we do it? I think there's a lot of reasons why we do it, but the particular reason I want to focus on today is the power of our instinctive response to visible poverty. There's a wealth of sociological studies that prove that when people are exposed to evidence of visible poverty, they react with fear, disgust, and even anger. People who witness it react with fear, disgust, and anger in more extreme ways than they do if they are exposed to any other marginalized trait, including traits that we historically associate with discrimination, such as race or gender. And this is borne out even in neurological tests, you know, when they put the probes on your brain to see what parts of your brain are firing in response to visual stimuli. Even neurological tests prove that. The thing we react to the most negatively when we see it deep in the recesses of our brains is visible poverty. So when we think about criminalization, it manifests itself in our laws. This instinct, this powerful instinct manifests itself in our laws. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, in 2014, they're going to be releasing a new report in November, but in 2014 they released, they've been tracking 187 cities, criminalization laws in 187 cities for well over a decade, about 12 years now. And they've been looking at changes in criminalization laws in these cities for that long period of time, and each year they track it and they produce a report. The last report that they produced looked at changes in criminalization laws between 2011 and 2014. And what they found was very disturbing. These are just a few isolated findings from that particular study. It showed the dizzying popularity and the incredible rates at which these laws are increasing. They found that citywide bans, I just want to wrap our minds around that, citywide bans, no place for you to be legally, citywide bans on camping in public increased by 60% in 40 years. Citywide bans on begging. So you're free to go out to the cornfields and beg to whoever might be around, a scarecrow. But in the city, increased by 25%. Citywide bans on standing around increased by 35%. Bans on sitting or lying down, 43% increase in 4 years. And bans on sleeping or living in your vehicles, that's that thin line between you and the street, a staggering 119% increase in 4 years. Our Homeless Rights Advocacy project looked a little deeper at issues here in Washington, and we released a report. We released a bunch of reports, but one of them was released in 2015, and it looked at the scope of criminalization here in Washington. And we similarly found some very disturbing results. What we found was that 78% of cities throughout the state of Washington criminalized sitting or standing, 75% criminalized sleeping in public, and 63% criminalized camping. Understand that in many jurisdictions, the way that camping is defined is so broad that it can encompass even temporary efforts to survive, like propping your coat up on 2 sticks to protect yourself from the rain. That can be a violation of the law. We also found some other very disturbing discoveries. We found that a significant number of people in Washington state spend 90 days or more in jail for violating these laws. 90 days or more in jail. We determined that as income inequality grows in any particular city, the rate at which those cities criminalize this conduct also goes up, right? So in other words, the greater the gap between the rich and poor in any particular city, the more likely that space is to be punitive to the poor and homeless people in its boundaries. So we've been good at this for a very long time. It's what I'm talking about now are just contemporary snapshots of criminalization, but we've been experts at this for years. Jim Crow, anti-Okie laws, sundown town laws, these are all just a few notorious examples of the way that we have used the law to restrict the visibility of undesirable people in public space. We're experts at this. The difference is that, at least with respect to these laws, we've since rejected them. And when we look back at these legal artifacts, we do it with some collective sense of shame. But it's not the case. We don't have that same perspective with respect to criminalizing homelessness. But we need to be very aware of the fact that the same people who were disproportionately impacted by historical laws that said you cannot be here legally are also disproportionately impacted by criminalization laws. And we know this because many of those same marginalized groups are disproportionately represented in homeless populations. People of color, single female-headed families, people with mental illness or addiction, people with physical disabilities. I didn't even mention ugly laws. Have you guys ever heard about ugly laws? Those were on the books until the 1970s. So people with physical disfigurations could not be seen in public places. And I think Chicago was the last one to remove that from its books in the 1970s. LGBTQ youth, immigrants, all of these marginalized groups are disproportionately represented in homeless populations. But still, we don't really think about criminalization laws as having anything to do with implicit bias. We don't think about it as having anything to do with discrimination. There's a lot of ways that we perpetuate the marginalization of people experiencing homelessness. This is so deeply embedded in our DNA. One is the bootstrap work ethic. America, we love our bootstrap work ethic, and this is this sort of cheery idea that if you just work hard enough, you too can escape poverty. We know that over a quarter of Americans believe that income inequality, the #1 cause of income inequality, is the failure of the poor to work as hard as the more affluent. We cling to the fiction that homelessness is just simply a bad choice, that people experiencing homelessness don't want help. They don't want anything better for themselves. So this sort of cultural orientation that we have is part of what allows us to generate these laws at this dizzying rate. we have seen, especially here in the city of Seattle, but certainly throughout the country, there's a lot of focus on states of emergency, right? What can we do exactly right now to solve the problem? And so focuses on emergency shelter can often distract us from the really painful and hard and complicated work of thinking about how we're going to come up with longer-term solutions about homelessness and poverty. When I haven't spent time at New Horizons, and I'd love to have that opportunity. I do a lot of work with Mary's Place and youth care, and I've talked to a lot of people who go to both of those facilities, and they've told me the reasons why they don't like to go to emergency shelters. It's one of those things that a lot of times people will just say, well, why don't they just go someplace? They've got places to go. They just should get out of my visible range. And what they've expressed to me most commonly is that they've felt like shelters have too high of barriers to entry. In a lot of situations, I also spend a lot of time at the Greenbelt, otherwise known as the jungle. And when, I'm sure many of you know people who live in those areas as well. The offers that are given to them for shelter or services have had conditions or requirements attached to them. And some of those conditions and requirements require them to split up from people that they consider to be family members. They require them to get rid of their beloved pets, who are the only stable source of emotional connection in a lot of people's lives. They require them to give up their sense of community or their actual community. And a lot of times what they have to do is get rid of most, if not all, of their personal belongings. In other circumstances, people feel like there's degrees of privacy. There's some sort of conditions or requirements that they have to fill out a ton of paperwork. They have to tell about what their personal beliefs are. They have to explain what their sexual orientation or identity or gender identity might be. This is the case in some shelters. And so they feel very frequently, as you guys know, it's a human instinct to want to preserve your sense of privacy and autonomy and dignity. And so when we think about that narrative, and I'm sure you guys have heard it, where people will just say, I don't understand why somebody would refuse an offer of shelter. Have you heard that? I'm seeing some nods. So why don't they just accept the offer of shelter? What I say to those people is, would you accept it for yourself if you were required to give up all of those things for one night of sleeping among people that you don't necessarily know, and then have to go back out on the street the first thing the next morning? Is that something that you would ever choose for yourself? And for most of them, they've never even considered that possibility, that it might not be a meaningful offer of shelter or service to the extent that they would not ever choose that for themselves. I met a woman not too long ago who was telling me about her struggles to find a place to be with her 16-year-old son. And that's painful. That's painful. If you can't find a place to be with your 16-year-old son. I have a 13-year-old son, so this is hitting me hard. Her name's Francine. She's just an amazing, amazing person. And that's how difficult it's been to her. This is such a deep experience for so many people that even when a meaningful offer of service or shelter comes along, reasonable people who are experiencing homelessness might reject it because they've learned that it doesn't give them that experience of a home. It doesn't give them some sense of a real human place to belong. So I urge people to think about the fact that when we talk about what a reasonable offer of shelter or service is, we have to consider the possibility that we're not really giving people real meaningful choices. And that these are not opportunities or options that we would ever choose for ourselves. I feel like I can never talk about this without crying at some point. So, I even have my Kleenex up here just in case. So I've depressed myself. I hopefully haven't completely depressed you guys. But there are solutions, and a lot of them are relatively straightforward. My mentor, Brian Stevenson, I've mentioned him before. I've learned a lot about him, and I certainly have seen this in my own life. The way that these laws work right now, the way that criminalization laws work, their primary achievement is to remove visible poverty from view. And I'm actually arguing that what's necessary is the opposite. I think that as long as poverty is a crisis, it needs to be visible in public space, because it's the only way we're going to be confronted to do anything about it. As long as we're able to push it out of view, people can then relax and be comfortable and feel like it doesn't exist. But as long as it does exist, we need to be able to see it. This notion of proximity is something that Brian talks about in his book Just Mercy, but also in his work, generally speaking, about the death penalty and criminal justice work generally. This is the idea that the only way that we can achieve justice is to get close to it, to show up and see things with our own eyes, right? Because only in those circumstances are we going to feel compelled to actually do anything about it. It's also important to think about whether we can come up with feasible solutions. The only real way to come up with a feasible solution is to get an up-close personal view of it. And yet we have people in the city council and a lot of lawmakers who have never one time spent any meaningful time with people experiencing poverty and homelessness. It blows my mind how people will resist proximity. The reality is, if you, and I know you guys have seen this too, if you get to know people who are experiencing poverty and homelessness, they will transform you. That proximity will put you in a position where you ultimately cannot rest until some change is secured. And you guys are all part of that process. You guys are all part of the army of people who are in a position to secure change because you have that proximity. Most people don't. So that's why if you're talking to others, I don't know if you guys are surrounded by people who completely understand and love the work that you're doing, or if you ever run across people who say, oh, I could never do that. Or if you've ever heard people say derogatory terms about people who are poor or homeless. I direct the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project, and I'm surrounded by progressive people all the time, and it's astonishing what will come out of their mouths. This is where I say, you know, when's the last time that you actually spent some meaningful time with someone who's experiencing poverty or homelessness? Obviously, you guys are right in the trenches of it in the work that you do. If you don't know Rex Holbein, how many people know Rex? Oh, he's the best. He's the best, and he has an amazing, amazing community at Facing Homelessness. That's another way for you to see maybe a different side than some of the volunteer work that you do. Go and spend some time with Rex. Go to Facing Homelessness and hang out there for a day. That community is amazing. There's a new, does anybody know Graham Press? Do you know Graham? Okay, so Graham has come up with a new website called We Count. Do you know about a web?
I actually have the data from my property, so We Count.
Nice. What, I'm sorry, what's your name? Avon? Okay, Avon will tell you how awesome We Count is. We Count, you can go to your computer, you can sign up on the web, and it'll immediately connect you with people experiencing homelessness and let you know exactly what it is that they're needing right now in order to get through the day. These are things that anybody you talk to can do, right? So I would encourage you, challenge people. If you hear someone and you're like, no, they're not quite understanding this, let me make a suggestion to you. You can be that annoying person who's like, let me just make a suggestion to you. These are things that people can do, anyone can do, to increase the opportunities for proximity. Cities also have a lot to do. I spend a lot of time getting yelled at by city officials. Sometimes they're sort of nice to me, but mostly they yell at me. And that's because we have the series of reports HRAP has issued. I see a couple of copies on your table. We've issued these reports that have a lot of specific and numerous recommendations in them for cities. Sometimes we highlight cities that are doing things really badly, and that always makes fans, makes people really excited about me. But I have had also a lot of city officials say, can you make it any simpler? Can you just come up with like a simple 1, 2, 3 list? The answer is no, but I decided to indulge them anyway and came up with a list that I called 12 steps to mitigate the criminalization of homelessness. And it's on our the HRAP webpage. And this is just a summary extraction of some of those things. Some of them range from making specific changes in the law to collecting more transparent data. So there's a lot that cities can do to examine their own practices and see what sort of disproportionate and negative impact they're having on people experiencing homelessness. But I think the most important one is a recommendation that the city consider providing leadership opportunities, paid leadership opportunities for people experiencing homelessness on an advisory board that has direct and regular access to policymakers because of the need for proximity. They pass these laws and they've not talked to anybody experiencing homelessness. They've not had that sort of proximity where they really understand. They don't get that up close personal view of what the problems are or who the people are that are being affected. So cities definitely have a lot to do. I want to close with, this is Samia, and a lot of you will probably be familiar with her because she's on your website. And I watched the video and I cried then too. I was crying. It's a problem I'm working on. But Samia, of course, has had some incredible experiences with New Horizons. And coming in 17 and pregnant, having that opportunity to work with New Horizons, as I was watching it, I was thinking to myself, this is about Samia's journey, but I would invite all of you to think about how she transformed people who were working with her. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, that everyone that we're working with, it's not just about what we're doing for them, it's about what they're doing for us, the ways that they're transforming us and helping us to get to that point where we are not going to merely tolerate each other. To go back to Randall Stevenson's quote at the very beginning, the point is not to tolerate each other, it's to try and understand each other. And as long as all of you are willing to continue to get into that space, that uncomfortable space that suggests that there might be something that you need to learn, right, from other people, that's, I think, what keeps this engine of social change going.